In 1997, 6 skydivers attempted to set new world records for skydiving in Antarctica. They aimed to achieve the first 4-way skydive and the first ever tandem skydive on the frozen continent. But skydiving in Antarctica proved to be a unique new challenge for the experienced skydivers. Thin air, unpredictable weather, and bone-chilling temperatures are just a few of the things they had to prepare for. What started out as a new, exciting experience for all the seasoned skydivers ended up being one of the worst civilian skydiving disasters in history. Adventure Network International began organizing tours to Antarctica in 1988. They dubbed Antarctica the ultimate destination for experienced skydivers. Back in '97, only a handful of people jumped there, and this expedition marked the company's first skydiving group expedition to Antarctica. Most of Antarctica experiences 6 months of constant daylight in summer and 6 months of darkness in the winter. It's the highest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. The weather is cold, dry, and windy. Average mid-season temperatures range from -24 to -1 Celsius. Skydivers say jumping there is much riskier, but it's mainly due to the unpredictable weather. Weather patterns can change quickly, and because it's so windy, the wind is a major issue. Temperatures while jumping can be -35 Celsius, and that's not factoring in the speed at which a diver is plummeting to the ground. On the descent, temperatures can easily be -100 Celsius. Another one of the dangers in skydiving in Antarctica is landing outside the designated drop zone. It can be deadly, mostly because of the many crevasses that a jumper could inadvertently land in. The 6 skydivers in this story were all self-admitted adventure junkies. At the time, Michael Kearns was 39 and a former Air Force captain with over 18 years of military parachuting experience. He had over 750 jumps under his belt. And he wanted to skydive on every continent. He only had 3 left: Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. One day in 1997, he saw an ad in Skydiving magazine, and that ad said, "Skydive the North Pole." He'd been wanting to skydive in Antarctica for over 20 years. So he sent in his resume to Steve Mulholland, who was organizing the trip for Adventure Network International. Steve Mulholland was 36 and from Seattle. Michael described him as a long-haired, tie-dyed sky god. His passion was actually leaping off of skyscrapers and bridges, otherwise known as base jumping. He jumped off the 60-story high Space Needle in the first authorized jump off of it. Steve was a carpenter by trade, but worked only to finance his adventures, which also included scuba diving in Australia and mountain climbing in Antarctica. The trip fee was $22,000, and it was waived for Steve because he was organizing the trip. He'd been to Antarctica before, and he just loved living on the ice. He actually worked as a carpenter there for 3 seasons. And he was also the first person to jump off a mountain in Antarctica. It wasn't allowed, but friends said that he just couldn't resist it. He wanted to be the first person to base jump on every continent. Ray Miller was from Ohio and owned a carpet cleaning company and a successful marketing firm. He'd been skydiving all over the North Pole, and he jumped over 500 times. In addition to skydiving, which he'd been doing for about 14 years, he rock climbed, and he just loved jumping off bridges. And he was also part of a record-setting 83 skydiver expedition to the North Pole in 1994. And for the Antarctica trip, Ray also cut a deal with Adventure Network International. He agreed to promote the trip and help organize it, and then they would pay all of his expenses. He agreed to wear a helmet cam to record the jump, even though he had very little experience with cameras. Hans Riesack was 49 and from Austria. He was described as a tattooed giant who delighted in having his girlfriend skydive naked with him. He owned a pub in Vienna and jumped at the North Pole earlier in 1997, and he wanted to jump the South Pole that year as well so he could do them both in the same year, and that would be another skydiving record. All 4 were veteran jumpers, and you can kind of see they had a little bit of an obsession with setting new records. And Ray and Michael were part of the first group of civilians to jump out of a 727 jet. Rounding out the expedition were 2 Norwegians. According to their website, Trond Jacobsen was an instructor at a local skydiving club. He put safety first, he was professional and experienced. And Morten Halvorsen was going to be tandem jumping with Trond. Morten was an instructor in winter survival. It said that he was serious, loyal, and cheerful. Their tandem jump would also be the first at the South Pole, so they'd be setting a record too. The 6-person team met at Punta Arenas, the southernmost city in Chile. They met for the first time here, and they stayed for a few days until their departure to Antarctica. They had to wait a few days in Chile for the weather to clear at Patriot Hills, which is the base camp that they would fly to in Antarctica. While they had that time to kill, they bonded over their passion for skydiving and adventures while chatting over pizza and beer at their local hotel. The 3 Americans and the Austrian thought that they were going to be the first to jump over the South Pole, but Morten and Trond told them that no, actually a fellow Norwegian had completed that in 1992, so they wouldn't be the first. But that didn't deter them, and they thought of other ways that they could set records. Steve came up with an idea, and that was to try a 4-way formation in the sky. It hadn't ever been done over the South Pole, so this was their chance to set a new record. And the others thought it was a great idea, so they all started practicing and planning the formation jump. They did their final checks and prepared their equipment before they left Chile on December 3rd. They took a 6-hour flight to the southernmost runway in the world, the Blue Ice Runway at Patriot Hills. They spent 2 more days camped out at Patriot Hills, hanging out more and learning more about each other. So as they got to know each other, that weather window started to open. So they checked each other's equipment multiple times, and Michael had a bunch of new gear, including a new helmet that he had tested at home by putting his head in a freezer. He was hoping to simulate the Antarctic conditions. When the weather allowed, they took the 6-hour flight to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. They checked their equipment 4 more times and suited up. They were bulked up with multiple layers of winter clothing because of the extreme temperatures, and Michael even had on 3 sets of gloves. Each skydiver had an altimeter, the instrument that tells them how high they are, and the plan was to break off from the 4-way formation at around 4,000 feet. That would give each diver time and room to open their parachutes. The 4 went over their strategy, practicing the formation multiple times, and it wasn't even considered a particularly difficult maneuver in the air. They were seasoned skydivers and had done this and more difficult maneuvers many times. They posed for photos here at Patriot Hills just before they took off into the sky again, this time for their record-setting jump. The weather was clear and relatively warm for Antarctica at -35 Celsius with almost no wind. It was the perfect day for a skydive at the South Pole. As they made the final gear check, the Norwegians and Michael calibrated the automatic activation device, or AAD, on their reserve parachutes. An AAD automatically deploys the parachute at a certain altitude, so if the skydiver can't manually deploy it, it sets off this explosive charge that automatically opens the reserve chute. So if the skydiver is unconscious or just unable to open their chute, it opens automatically at a certain altitude. As they were flying up to altitude, Michael and the Norwegians used supplemental oxygen. In normal dives, skydivers wouldn't need the oxygen, but Antarctica is already at 9,186 feet above sea level. While jumping, they'd be an extra 8,000 feet higher, which put them at around 17,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin. There would be risk of suffering from lack of oxygen or hypoxia at this altitude, and it can severely affect your judgment, your vision, it gives people headaches. But the most dangerous part is that you don't know you're hypoxic until it's too late. Michael underwent rigorous training for hypoxia in the military, and he said that it's a little like being drunk, like you feel giddy and happy, and he said a minute feels like an hour. The Norwegians actually asked for supplemental oxygen at Patriot Hills. They wanted to use it in the Twin Otter and were actually told that it probably wouldn't be necessary. But they insisted because they knew that oxygen at that altitude would be absolutely necessary. There was only 1 tank and only 1 oxygen mask for everyone to use. After the Norwegians and Michael used the oxygen, they passed it to the others, but they refused to take it. They tried passing it around a few times as they were taking it throughout the flight up, but the others just kept refusing. So there's also another problem that's caused by the thin air, and that's less resistance when falling, so you fall fast, much faster than normal. Because of this, the team would have only about 40 seconds until impact. They'd have to complete the formation in about 18 to 20 seconds and then break away by 3,500 feet to release their parachutes. When the plane got to 8,000 feet, the men prepared to jump. The four-way team jumped first. Ray was first out of the plane. Hans went second, Michael followed, and then Steve jumped last. The Norwegians waited about another 20 seconds and then they both jumped out. The skydivers fell at over 200 miles an hour in the thin air. It was minus 130 Celsius in the free fall. Michael looked at his altimeter repeatedly and all seemed to be good right at the start. The four were closing in on each other. They were getting really close to that formation. They were so close they could almost touch. And they were almost breaking the record when suddenly Michael realized that something was very wrong. He felt disoriented. With the sun and the ice and just an all-white landscape everywhere, he was confused. He checked his altimeter again, and to his horror, they were in the red zone. And not just in the red zone, they were halfway into the red zone, which meant they were only at about 1,000 feet above the ground. They should not have been this low yet. This meant seconds to impact. Michael thought he was going to die, so he quickly waved his hands at the other divers and motioned at them to cut the formation. And he said that they just stared at him and kept falling and looking happy. There was no panic or flailing from them at all. Michael quickly broke away from the crowd and pulled the cord. But his reserve chute was already open. It had exploded out on its own. He was at about 600 to 700 feet above the ground. And remember, the original plan was to deploy it at 3,500 feet. So he quickly pulled in his feet and knees and crash landed hard in the snow, wrenching his spine in the process. He quickly ripped his mask off and frantically looked for the others. He saw the Norwegians far away landing, but no sign of the others. He then looked behind him, and about 100 yards away, he saw a tiny piece of Steve's canopy sticking out of a hole in the snow. Then he saw two other indentations that looked like snow angels. It was Ray and Hans. They never pulled their chutes. They landed next to each other on their stomachs with their arms fanned out as if they were still skydiving. The snow was stained red around them, and they hit with such force that they were buried 3 feet into the snow. The Norwegians recall it being extremely cold in the free fall. The tandem jump went just as they planned it though, and they had a nice, soft, normal landing. Their canopy opened and they were under canopy at 4,000 feet, so they fell for about 4 more minutes and then landed safely in the drop zone. But they did say that they could feel a lack of oxygen as they were landing, and it made them feel very tired, but they were also really happy that they successfully completed the first tandem jump at the South Pole. And they had tested all their gear before the trip to make sure that it would withstand the extreme cold, and that may have been a factor in their survival. Trond and Morton recalled that the four-way team had more clothes than normal because of the winter conditions, but they also noticed that some of them were only wearing thin gloves. 2 of them had full face helmets that were actually starting to freeze in the doorway of the plane before the jump. So what happened? Michael later said that the increased effort required for the four-way formation could have brought on the confusion. Or perhaps the others were trying so hard to grab Hans, they forgot to look at their altimeters. The faster free fall in thin air could have thrown their timing off. The whiteout confused Michael and may have disoriented the others as well. They were all very experienced skydivers with hundreds of jumps each. They'd skydive all around the world and they knew about cold weather jumping. Bill Booth, a Florida skydiving outfitter who previously jumped with Ray, said they didn't do anything really stupid. It was probably a combination of little errors. But this high-altitude attempt posed several hazards which may not have been dealt with properly. The free fall velocity in the thin air can throw the jumper's timing off. It was the group's desire to execute a four-way formation. However, that perhaps clinched the outcome. The oxygen-draining effort required for the formation may have accelerated the onset of hypoxia, and the maneuver they were trying to do may have also sucked them down, a phenomenon in which jumpers focusing on the formation lose track of altitude. Finally, those who died did not have AADs or any warning device that beep at a preset minimum altitude. Michael McDowell, president of the Adventure Network International at the time, said about the oxygen, "Who the hell knows why they didn't use it? We provided it and recommended it. They were extremely experienced skydivers who had each jumped hundreds of times. Did they make a mistake? I don't know. but it certainly is in the realm of possibilities. Lack of oxygen can make your brain less agile. But this statement is in direct contrast with what the Norwegians said about having difficulty and some resistance in getting supplemental oxygen. Michael later talked to NPR about the incident, and he said he didn't believe that any of them were badly hypoxic. He said, "I think we were all prepared and ready for the jump when we did finally jump." He said they had no idea they were that close to the ground, and that was the big issue. He said there's no visual clues that you would normally use. You'd normally see trees and cars getting bigger, homes getting bigger, the airfield getting bigger. You'd be able to see where you are. But it was completely just a white landscape, white ground and white landscape. When asked if they could have prepared better and anticipated the lack of having a reference point to judge their altitude, Michael replied, "We all felt very comfortable with each other's skills and abilities. We felt that we had prepared properly. We had gone over the jump probably a dozen times before we actually got to the South Pole, and then again there we did it many times without equipment." He also said that he encourages all skydivers to have automatic opening devices because he believed it saved his life. And finally, he said, "We were in Antarctica. We had lots of time on our hands. The sun was always up, 24 hours a day. We got very close with each other, and we exchanged stories and talked about all the things that we've seen in our skydiving careers." They all talked about the possibility of dying while skydiving, and they all agreed that if there ever came a situation where they had to face their own mortality while skydiving, at least it would be while they were pursuing something they were truly passionate about. Steve wrote in a letter to his friend before the jump and said, "The wonders of Antarctica are countless, and I feel fortunate to have seen just a very few of them. Man has left his footprint here, but without a doubt, the environment has not been tamed and nature rules all."